Hi, and welcome to Chapter 6 Creative and Critical Thinking in the Small Group. So, creative and critical thinking is at the heart of effective group decision making, and this chapter is designed to show you the specific steps important to creative and critical thinking. My goal here is to demystify the concept of critical thinking by breaking it down into manageable components. In addition, I hope you will appreciate the amount of effort required for individuals and groups to think critically and creatively as they engage in group processes. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So first, what is creative thinking? So when we think about creative thinking, what we're talking about is encouraging the use of a hunch, intuition, insight, and fantasy to promote creativity in the group. So if you remember from the previous chapter, we talked about fantasy and storytelling. This is that and a lot more that's ultimately applied inside the group to help promote the creativity in the tasks that the group comes through. A few things to consider here at the outset. Groups can be major sources of creative ideas and innovations. And in fact, most of the amazing innovations and ideas that we've seen over the last 40 years have been the direct product of people working together in groups and teams and to create those ideas. Further, group creativity is both divergent and convergent. So when we talk about divergent, this is the idea that ideas and groups should and do vary, whereas convergent thinking is that ideas ultimately must come together. So when you think about creativity, it's a combination of both of those things. So creating creativity. For a group to be creative, both individual and group creativity are needed. This means that creative individuals as well as groups being creative are something that we need for groups to ultimately come together and be creative. Creative individuals are individuals that tolerate, ambiguity, they have low levels of communication apprehension, and really aren't afraid to violate societal norms and rules to try out new things. If you ever, for those of you that perhaps are a little bit older, you can remember Apple Computers' advertising campaign in the 1990s of "Think Different." That was the whole idea of that, is to think different, be a creative individual, and come up with amazing ideas. We'll leave the idea of conforming together and joining the cult of Apple to another day and conversation. Nonetheless, for now, think different. Groups are tend to be creative when they have a relaxed atmosphere and are able to goof around and have a good time. If you have groups that don't have a relaxed atmosphere and are too serious, they're never going to be able to be creative. So, when you think of this from an applied theoretical perspective, you have to ask yourself how we can enhance group creativity. Well, the answer is there are several ways to do that, and the following slides are going to be review some useful techniques that you can use to make that happen. So, one of the first ways of enhancing group creativity is through the practice of brainstorming. And so, what brainstorming is a procedure that is designed to tap into members' creativity by asking them to generate as many ideas as possible without evaluation. And so, when we move on to the next slide, we can see how you actually go about doing that and some ground rules that you should consider in terms of that. So, a few guidelines for brainstorming. So, the basic brainstorming guidelines include this. First, number one, group preview needs to preview the rules for brainstorming. That means before you set out and get ready to have your conversation and have your brainstorming session, you got to lay some rules out on the table so everyone's aware of what those are. All right. Then you need to, number two, you need to go ahead and present what the problem is to solve. Why is the group trying to brainstorm in the first place? Get that problem out there, get it on the table so everyone's aware at what the background and the context of the issue that their brainstorming ideas are for. Then at that point, the next thing that you need to do is talk about that is that members need to be encouraged to come up with as many solutions to the problem as possible. Now, the rules here and the guiding principles here is that quantity is our goal. Not necessarily quality, but it's not going to matter because the second thing we have to consider is we are not evaluating at this time. You should try to limit yourself verbally and non-verbally as to any evaluation of ideas. We just want ideas on the table and as many as possible. So don't quit generating those ideas too soon. Get as many as you can out, even if it seems way more and that they're out there out in the ballpark, it's fine. You want those out there. The next thing is that you want to record everything. All ideas are recorded so that the whole group can see them and experience them and ultimately at a later point in time evaluate them. So then that leaves us to the final point that you should review the ideas elsewhere. Brainstorming sessions should be left to just brainstorming. If you're going to have an idea and come together and brainstorming, you should do something to break it up before the development time. Go get dinner or something or do it next week. So then finally, once you have completed the brainstorming session, then the ideas are evaluated at another session. And at that time, they can be modified or combined with other ideas that you have. So at this point, I guess it's useful to point out that there are several variations to brainstorming that you can use, such as brain writing, where you have people write ideas and contribute into a pot, or using electronic brainstorming software, where you come together in a cloud type environment and people can either be identified or anonymously contribute ideas in brainstorming to a brainstorming session that you can evaluate. But still, all the basic guidelines still apply. All right, next tool that's useful to discuss is that of synetics. And what we're talking about here is a procedure designed to stimulate creative thinking through the use of metaphor and looking for similarities in different things. So what we're really here is trying to trigger insights, right? So using metaphors, jumping around, trying to come up with ideas and come up with different insights to kind of get those creative juices flowing. So some ways that you can go about doing this in that process is actually engage in like a process of changing your perspective, trying to look for a direct comparison to the issues and ideas that you're bringing out or the metaphors that you're discussing. And sometimes it's even useful to temporarily suspend reality to see what alternatives might surface and such to do that. And I couldn't think of a better visual aid than people changing their perspective and standing on a banana. Moving on. All right, so the next tool that's useful to us is that of mind mapping. And what mind mapping is a procedure that is designed to break out of linear thinking and move it to like a radiant thinking by free association. So when you engage in mind mapping, the idea here is that this is a process that taps into members' creativity by encouraging them to actually make visual connections that they would ever make. So actually taking these ideas, drawing them out, mapping them together, and diagramming them together. So just like brainstorming, if you're engaged in the process of doing mind mapping, you should leave criticism out as you develop the mind map. And once the mind map has been developed, then you can look at it and come up with some ideas based on that. All right. So that takes us through the basic methods for creative thinking. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some critical thinking. So critical thinking in groups is one of the most important skills a group can develop during problem solving and other group work. The following slides are going to cover some of the basic elements of critical thinking and introduce how critical thinking functions inside a group. So what makes thinking critical? When we talk about critical thinking, what we're talking about is a method of systematic thinking that uses evidence and reasoning and logic to promote soundness. So let's go ahead and review some of those concepts. First off, evidence. When we're talking about evidence, we're interested in facts, data, opinions, and other information that can ultimately back a claim up or support a conclusion. And this kind of relates to the idea of arguments. And what arguments are claims that are supported by evidence and reasoning. So making a claim and supporting it with evidence, thus you are making an argument. All right, so let's take a moment here and watch a quick clip and do a quick case study, just a thought experiment on how having a lack of critical thinking or a culture that lacks critical thinking can be problematic inside your study. So I'm going to quickly have us watch a short video clip. All right, so as you can see from that video clip, there were some major problems with NASA in the early 2000s. So to provide a little background on what you just watched, on February 1st, 2003, many of us watched in horror as the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated upon reentry, after what had been a pretty successful mission in space. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, conducted an investigation into the causes and zeroed in on pieces of foam insulation that had detached during liftoff. Ultimately, this damaged and knocked off some insulation tiles that had been designed to protect the shuttle from the extreme heat of the reentry process. So once the shuttle was no longer shielded from the heat, the fuel tank inside the shuttle exploded, killing all of the astronauts on board. The NASA records disclosed that the foam insulation had caused damage to the tiles since the very first shuttle launch. There was even one NASA official that said, lamented, how were these signals missed? In early 2004, NASA finally released the results of an internal survey of its employees, which showed that the culture of NASA contributed to why these signals were missed. The survey, completed by only 45% of the employees, revealed that many employees are afraid to speak out about safety concerns and are reluctant to express dissenting views in a large group. One NASA administrator pointed out that in NASA's culture, both managers and peers pressure dissenters to conform, even when they have safety concerns. One NASA employee said, "We don't have time to listen to everybody moan and groan about every issue out there." NASA continued that mindset, NASA concluded that mindset is partially what contributed to the Columbia disaster. This isn't the first time NASA's culture has been implicated in the disaster. The 1986 explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger shortly after takeoff was caused by malfunction of O-ring seals on the solid rocket boosters, a particularly distressing event because, like the problems with the foam insulation, NASA knew about the potential problems with the O-rings failing in a seal in cold weather. In other words, the Challenger disaster was predictable. So the decision-making procedures should have revealed the O-ring safety concern, but did not. Communication scholars have had time to since analyze the decision-making procedures leading to the Challenger disaster and have concluded that the procedure was flawed in several ways. First, NASA officials were biased in favor of the launch because several previous postponements. The engineers showed the most concern about the O-rings, but were reluctant to bypass their chain of command to demand that superiors pay attention to their concerns. The engineers also failed to make their objections clear and that they used ambiguous language that minimized the significance of their concern. Several decision makers discounted the relevance of the pertinent technical information, and had it been seriously considered, would have led to a postponement of the launch. So even a group of highly trained experts can arrive at a fatally flawed decision that ignores relevant information. In other words, the group didn't think critically. So taking this into account, where did they go wrong? Try to think for a few minutes, what are some of the ways that NASA could have changed organizationally or culturally to promote more critical thinking? So maybe put yourself in the place of a consultant. What recommendations would you make to NASA on how they could ultimately improve their culture to not have tragedies like this happen again? All right. Next, we're going to look at some strategies to enhance critical thinking in group settings. All right, one of the biggest things is having the right attitude. The first thing is just be open minded. And being open minded is this idea of being willing to consider new information ideas, even if they contradict with previously held beliefs that you had. Um, on top of that, it's also important to be skeptical. Like having a sense of what we call show me skepticism that indicates that members want to think for yourself can be very useful for enhancing the critical thinking inside the group. And then finally, just thinking of critical thinking as an active rather than a passive process, right? So when you have information, actively engage that information, look at that, test it, evaluate it, be skeptical about it. All elements of having the right attitude towards critical thinking. All right, gathering information. Gathering information, i.e., the ability to organize your ideas, is absolutely critical to the group's ability to critically analyze information. So, there's a couple key things here. First, assessing information needs. To engage in critical thinking and to be able to gather the information you need to do that, you need to have the skills in front of you to be able to figure out what you need to know, right? So you need to be competent in determining what information you need before you set out to find it. Once you have an idea of the information that you need to know, you then need to have the skills and resources available to you to go ahead and collect those resources. So there's a variety of different ways. So once you know what you need, it's just about how to go to get it. And I'll take you briefly through some of the key ways that people go ahead and get the information they need. First was which is through direct observation. Oftentimes, empirically observing things and phenomena that actually happen is some of the best way for that we can collect information and move forward. So directly observing things that are happening and making use of that. Second, which is that of reading. Pretty much anything that you get your hands on that's about the issue or the problem or the task that you're trying to accomplish, reading and looking at the knowledge base that exists for that is highly beneficial. And so, grabbing scholarly books, periodicals, and things that are actually in print are great. Next is having access to the internet. The internet has really changed information gathering for a time because for the first time in human history, you literally have the entire body of human knowledge available to you at your fingertips, giving you access to a multiplicity of information that can give you background and context on situations. From there, we talk about related things like electronic databases that can give you even a deeper view. And we'll talk about this a lot more in depth when we get to our research methods lecture. From there, doing things like conducting interviews can give you insight into specific lived experience on people's that have dealt with the task at hand before or experienced the problem. And there also are surely to be a variety of other sources out there that might provide the information and tools useful to you in accomplishing your said task. So once you have the information, you then have to critically engage in the process of evaluating said information. So what this really gets at is determine the meaning of what is said. And so it's important before we get too far here is the importance of being able to distinguish fact from opinion. So when we're talking about facts, we're talking about something that can be verified by not observation and is not really arguable. So something that we would call to be a truism. There's enough evidence supporting it that we don't need to question it. These are the facts of the situation. It's been observed, and so it is. Whereas opinions are more like inferences that go beyond fact and contain some degree of probability, right? So we may have some support and some ideas, but it's not concrete, and it may or may not agree. So we throw a warrant in there to designate a certain amount of uncertainty about the information that we're dealing with. So it's important that when engaging in these critical thinking processes, that we make sure to identify and clarify any ambiguous terms that take place through the communication. And when we're talking about ambiguous terms, this is a term that has more than one possible meaning. So just to make sure that we're clear about the information that we're having and there aren't any miscommunicated processes that take place inside of that. So the next thing that's important is to determine the credibility of the source that you come across. So as a critical evaluator of information, you need to determine whether or not your source is credible. So particularly when we're evaluating opinions, this is important. So things that you can do are to ask key questions to help decide how much trust to place in a given opinion. You should ask yourself things like, is there any reason to suspect the person supplying the opinion of bias or wanting to slant things a certain way? You should ask whether the individual or source or other source is a recognized expert on the subject. Is there credibility that this person has? So, for example, if you're trying to come up with the best engine that should be installed in a new model of aircraft, obviously you would take the word of an aerospace engineer over a medical doctor. Even though both have credibility onto their own in their own fields, we would hope the aerospace engineer had a slightly better idea of what engine to use. But you never know. And then finally, you should ask, is the opinion consistent with other opinions expressed by the same source? So we want to make sure people are being consistent in the answers that they're giving us. All right, checking for errors in reasoning. So the reality is there are many ways to make errors in your own reasoning and your own critical thinking. In the following slides, I'm going to start by reviewing some fallacies and then have a short discussion on groupthink and how to avoid it. So there are various types of fallacies, probably hundreds out there. I've actually ever set time to count them all. In the following slides, I'm going to take you through a few examples. For a more in-depth look, you can check out the discussion of fallacies in the textbook, but also check out the fallacies handout that I posted to Blackboard. All right, so the first fallacy that we're going to look at is the broken window fallacy. All right, so as you can see from that example, the parable, also known as the broken window fallacy, demonstrates how opportunity costs as well as the law of unintended consequences affect economic activity in ways that are unseen or ignored. You can see how on a base level, the logic going into the broken window and how it would be good economically seemed to make sense and follow a logical flow, but ultimately was flawed or fallacious argument. All right, let's look at our next example. Next example is the slippery slope. Okay, so as you can see from that example, the slippery slope, we talk about slippery slope. This is a conclusion based on the premise that if A happens, then eventually through a series of small steps, through B and C and so on, X, Y, Z, will ultimately happen too. Basically equating A and Z. So if we don't want Z to occur, A must not be allowed to occur either. However, it's problematic in that there's no guarantee that those following steps will actually take place, and hence a failed fallacious argument. All right, so the next example is that of the ad hominem fallacy. Okay, so as you can see from that, the ad hominem is an attack on the character of the person rather than his or her opinions or arguments. And since it's just an attack on the character and not the actual substantive argument of the situation, again, failed fallacious argumentation. All right, couple more. All right, either or thinking. Here we go. All right, so as you can see from that example from the Colbert Report, either or thinking is when you're asking members to choose between only two options, as if no other choices exist. So again, in this example of Stephen Colbert talking to Congressman Frank, you can see that he didn't give him any options and locked him in, and so as a result from only seeing the world in two ways was problematic because it didn't deal with the multiplicity of ideas. All right, one more examples of fallacies. All right, so the next and final example is that of incomplete comparisons or the false analogy. All right, so as you can see from that commercial, you can see that it's a bit of a stretch. The incomplete comparison false analogy asks the audience to stretch a similarity a bit too far. So we have this in-depth conversation about ice cream, and all of a sudden we're talking about a luxury car. So a bit of a stretch, and ultimately through that is problematic and fallacious. So as I said, there are a plethora of different fallacies out there, and it's important as a critical thinker and evaluator of information and creator of arguments that you're aware of these different types of fallacies so that you can spot them and call people out on their use as well as avoid using them yourselves. So check that out. All right, so the final thing to talk about today, to finish our discussion of errors in reasoning, will be to take a brief look at how groups can avoid groupthink. So, groupthink is a psychological phenomenon that occurs within groups of people. It is the mode of thinking that happens when the desire for harmony and decision making of the group overrides the realistic appraisal of alternatives. So, when you have groupthink, group members try to minimize conflict and reach a consensus decision without critical evaluation of alternative ideas or viewpoints. Antecedent factors such as group cohesiveness, structural faults, and situational context can play into the likelihood of whether or not groupthink will impact the decision making process as well. So let's take a look. So, some of the key symptoms of groupthink. Um, Previously today, we talked about NASA, and I think that's a pretty good example of groupthink only taking place. But some of the symptoms that we can see is when groups overestimates its power and thinks that it has more power than it actually does. Also, when you see groupthink taking place, is when groups start to be closed-minded, i.e., they shut themselves off to other alternatives, other possibilities, other ideas, and that's highly problematic because they miss out on a lot of the context situation was taking place. Then also, when we see groupthink taking place, we see that group members feel pressure to conform, right? So just like back to our NASA, there was this pressure to conform and to downplay issues so they could make the launch happen and get things done. All of these symptoms of the groupthink process, and it's problematic. So you want to try to prevent groupthink inside groups that you interact with. So ways that you can go about that is by encouraging all members to discuss the problem at hand and allowing discussion to take place even if it seems like you're going around in circles. Value that dialogue. Secondly, establish a norm of critical evaluation in your groups, right? Make sure that you constantly are critically taking things apart. Some of the ways that you can do that is for a given conversation or even just throughout the group. You can have one person whose job it is to always play devil advocate. I.e., if everyone seems to be in agreement, have one person that objects for objection's sake, right? Have this person disagree, being obnoxious, be annoying, but make the group spend the time to discuss and look at different possibilities and just to be disagreeable. It's a good thing to have and important. So I recommend doing that. Third, you should prevent leaders from expressing their preferences early, right? So if you come into a conversation and you have a person in a leadership position and they express their preferences, that's going to be problematic. Established leaders should not express preferences. And it's part of the reason why I don't give you guys any suggestions in this class about how leadership should form inside your groups. If I designated leaders at the beginning of the class, chances are your groups would experience large problems and would be more susceptible to group things. We allow leadership to become emergent in the groups in this class, specifically to avoid this. So something to keep in mind. But if at this point of the semester you do have established leaders in your groups, you should make sure that those leaders basically keep their mouths shut until everyone else has had a chance to express their ideas. And then finally, make sure not to insulate the group from information, right? All those outside external outputs, you want to let them come into the group and influence and give ideas. That way, people can avoid groupthink and you can have a solid and effective, critically and creatively thinking group. All right, again, I want to thank you for your time. Hope you've enjoyed this review of critical and creative thinking. Have a great week.